All right, well, let me just then open up. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to this latest event in a series that has been organized by the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University on the issues that unfortunately came out wide and clear in the open in the aftermath of the killing of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis now several weeks ago. Many things have happened, as we all know, but we tried to highlight some of the underlying issues. And today we have a very important component of the continuum, which is police and police reform. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I serve as the president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C., and at the same time as chair of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University, an academic institution closely associated, affiliated with the Global Policy Institute. Before I turn it over to our moderator, my good friend and colleague Gina, I just would like to say just a couple of words, if I may. What I find stunning as a citizen, as an American, is when digging a little bit under the surface of many issues surrounding police brutality and worse, as we've seen with the killing of innocent people, is what I would call lack of accountability. That's what it looks to me, that in some special manner, bad policemen or women are somehow shielded from any responsibility, any accountability, in most cases, when they're responsible of bad actions. And I think this, unfortunately, breeds a very bad culture, because if you know that you can get away with almost anything, well, some bad people will do just that, and they will be shielded from, the consequences of their actions. Again, I don't want to preempt what our experts who really, really know a lot about these issues, and leave them to give us a sense of what's going on and what the road ahead may be to improve things in this nation. And I'm just going to turn it over to my good friend Gina, who will be the moderator for this event and who has been instrumental, along with Denise, my good friend and colleague, in organizing this panel. Many thanks, and welcome to all of you, new friends, old friends, and to our audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Well, good afternoon, and once again, and welcome to the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University series Beyond the Protest, where we have courageous conversations covering a multitude of topics related to the roots of racism, injustice, and inequality. Today, we will continue our discussion on defund or reform police forces. I am Dr. Gina Rupert. I serve as the Director of Student Success for BAU. I have prepared a few words from my own research just to give clarity and historical context to our topic today. History is not the past, it's the present. We demand an end to police brutality now was a message that appeared on protest posters during the 1963 March on Washington. Due to recent events, it's difficult to tell the difference, yet as a nation, we acknowledge the similarities. According to the Washington Post, Black Americans are 2.5 more times more likely than white Americans to be shot and killed by police officers. African Americans make up 13% of the US population, but account for 24% of people fatally shot by the police. The history of police brutality in the United States is long and painful, and serves as a grim reminder of the continuous oppression and violence that has disproportionately traumatized Black communities for generations. Many of the images from the protests of the 1960s resemble the Black Lives Matter marches today. The entire nation was outraged by recent instances in which many African Americans have been killed while in police custody. Over the past several weeks, protests have taken place in American cities and around the world, with protesters demanding law enforcement to change. Many believe that policing in America is broken and change is long overdue. But how and what can be done differently this time has prompted a national debate, and two different proposals have emerged for how to address police violence and how police forces operate now and how they should operate in America. Hence, the question to defund, reform police forces. Today, GPI and BAU has assembled an excellent group of experts. They're all attorneys, everyone. So let me start with my guests. We have Cynthia Deitle, Esquire. She is Director of Civil Rights Reform for the Matthew Shepard Foundation. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Mr. Michael Tobin. He is the Executive Director of District of Columbia Office of Police Complaints. Thank you, sir. Next, we have my good friend, Marcia K. Thompson, Esquire, Vice President, Law Enforcement Consulting, and our longstanding resident attorney, Mr. Johnnie Bond, Esquire, Attorney at Law. So let's go ahead and get started. What does defund the police mean, and what does reform mean? Anyone can take the lead. Michael, we'll start with you.
All right. Well, you know, I think that the starting point, as far as everyone might have their own definition of what defunding the police is. Here in DC, defunding the police, there are several different groups that are advocating it. Some are advocating complete elimination of the police departments. Some are advocating partial elimination of different parts of the police department. What the DC Council did yesterday was, in formulating their fiscal year 21 budget, was to reduce the police department budget for Metropolitan Police Department by about $15 million as part of that, and as a result, in part due to the defunding the police movement. And there was a lot of discussion about it, both in community groups and with the DC Council yesterday in the budget formulation. And I think, I mean, my bottom line, my understanding and my definition of it is there's a spectrum of it, a very vast spectrum of whether a police department is totally eliminated or certain departments are eliminated or part of the funding is eliminated. I think the way I look at it is, and you mentioned it partly in your introduction, Dr. Rupert, was I think part of the answer between the two different spectrums of defunding versus reforming the police is that this is a complicated matter, and I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle of defunding the police and reforming the police. And when we get to it, I'd like to talk about some of the examples that I think are the way forward about reforming the police versus defunding the police.
Thank you. Marcia?
Well, you know what? That's an interesting question. I won't answer it on a personal level, but I do think that what my colleague Mike just said is very apropos, that there is kind of a spectrum. I think there's no consensus nationally as to what defunding means. I think it doesn't have a universal definition as of yet, but I do think there's a spectrum of thoughts on the concept about that term. I think on one end, we have the thoughts about completely abolishing police. And on the other end, we have the defunding to mean reapportioning funds within your city to accomplish various aspects of public safety. I think most of that is saying, you know, reapportion our funds aligned with cross-functional aspects within the city to integrate services across those funding spectrums. And what I've been hearing from many of the voices that they're pushing for realigning of the funds to a broader concern around addressing underlying systemic issues, inequities, social justice issues within their cities that could be better aligned and reimagined with what policing services could become. I do think that during the process of realignment, when the cities are looking at their budgets, there has to be a strong community voice, substantive involvement in the process to prioritize how those funds are allocated, to uniquely represent each city and the communities they serve. I think that that approach embraces what we call co-produced policing public safety, and that co-standing for community. And if that piece is embraced throughout the country, I think it will help with integrating new perspectives, new voices, and how to move forward with a unified manner. But I do think that for me, it's more of the reform versus abolish. And I do think that that means reallocation of realigning of resources across your city.
Thank you for that. Cynthia?
I agree with Marcia. I think words really matter today. The word that you use around police reform, it matters what you say, because if you scream about defunding the police departments across our country, police agencies are going to very expectedly revolt against using a term that's going to eliminate their livelihoods and their power and their prestige, quite frankly. So I think, I don't know that defund is the right word. I think what we've come up with across, like Marcia said, across the spectrums is reform. And you can see people across political aisles, police officers, civil rights advocates that are agreeing on broad topics related to simply, I know it's a simple solution, right? But to simply start addressing how to reform our entire criminal justice system. And it's not just about the use of chokeholds or not, or improving training or not. It's about looking at the entire system of criminal justice in the United States and taking apart each of it and figuring out what we can do better, whether it's bail reform, incarceration, funding public defenders. You have to address each piece. Simply saying we're going to reform police departments is just but one symptom that needs to be addressed in the larger problem.
Thank you. Johnnie?
So it's a deep question, and I think one thing that I feel like I can do in this forum is kind of play devil's advocate on behalf of a very radical viewpoint for defunding the police, so that we have a voice in this panel discussion from it. These aren't my personal views, but taking their position as an attorney and saying, hey, let's throw this position in there. What I'd like to say, from what I can tell from my research into the defund the police movement, is that what it is at its root is a cry for radical change in how we view police, how we view their function, and how the police department interacts with the public. So at its root, it's a radical cry because they believe that reform, they've asked for reform before, and that has not helped. And so at its base, it's a radical cry for change and for radical change. And, to add a piece here, it's emerging now that it's not just defund, it's not just divest, it's defund and reinvest. It's divest and reinvest. And so that's a critical point that I think also adds a layer to the argument. When you stop at defund, you miss a larger part of what they're saying. I think the defund argument has been used to kind of break through the media barrage that we have to actually get the issue in front of people. And I think it's worked enough to get us to talk about it. But now let's add some layers to it. Defund and reinvest into a different type of police force. I think some police chiefs have come out and said that, we're overworked. We get called to respond to things that is not policing. And I think that is what, the defund movement is saying. Like, it's correct. Don't send a policeman out to respond to a mental health issue. Rather send out a mental health expert. And I think at the core of it, the defund and reinvest, or divest and reinvest, is one of the things that they want to be heard now. And I agree with everybody. It is a spectrum. There's another end of disabling or disbanding the police. I know in this political environment, nobody who really wants to see change or reform believes that that's a safe or effective way to go in this political environment. We have a very polarized political environment, and we're concerned about the message getting lost in that debate. But if I can just advocate on their behalf, it's a cry for radical change. And if it's disbanding so that we can actually revolutionize and radically change how we view police and how they act, then let's talk about it from disbanding it. And as to the extent that it's a local issue, it's going to come down to local governments changing their policies. And as Marcia said, it's going to be uniquely customized to the local environments. If disbanding works for them, then fine. But that's going to come down to them. But I think at the core of what we're talking about is having a radically different view of policing, defunding and divesting, and changing this so what happened to George Floyd and countless others does not happen ever again.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for giving us a background and framework for our participants and hearing the various viewpoints on defund versus reform. So next question. Last month, the Democrats introduced the police reform bill known as the Justice and Policing Act. However, Democrats and Republicans are clashing on key points, including cracking down on the excessive police force, the ban on chokeholds, establishing a national database to track police misconduct, mandating racial bias training, abolishing qualified immunity, and requiring police to use more body and dashboard cameras. My question, we often hear about police funding as reform. History suggests this method has been ineffective. However, some reform efforts are aimed to improve community and police interaction through training. Marcia, start with you. Just give us some background about, and I know you have worked in this area extensively with respect to training, working with police departments around throughout the country. So what does training look like? How will that benefit communities and improve the actions and conduct of police officers?
Let me start by saying thanks, Gina, for asking that question. You know, training has been around for police for a long time. We've you know, for specifically in the areas that we are addressing today, like in the areas of bias or constitutional policing or implicit bias, diversity, cultural competency, all of those areas, they're not new names. The way we train it may have changed or evolved over years, but it has been embraced and pushed in police departments for many years. And I think many departments have had some form of that type of training. One, has it been uniform? I think that goes to what my colleague Johnnie was talking about a minute ago. You know, we're talking about local police departments having training versus is this a national initiative that everyone should have a certain type of training? So I think one of the key points is it uniform, and has it been completed by every police department? I would likely say no. Every department in the country has probably not had one of those types of training, but I would say quite a few have had some of that type of training over the years. Again, maybe by a different name, but there has been a push to have that type of training. I think that the bigger question is, what do we need to do to make sure that that training sticks? Not necessarily whether or not they've had it. I know under prior administrations, there was a national push from a research perspective done by the 21st Century Task Force. And subsequent findings that came out of that report pushed for a national model, particularly on bias-free policing, implicit bias. It was a whole host of things that came out of that report. And there was a national push on that. And so that kind of goes to, again, a more national scope of what types of training would be appropriate for police to make it a better policing environment for our citizens, for our community, for everyone. Out of that initiative, all kinds of models were embraced. Research was supported. It was often free to police departments. So a lot of agencies took advantage of that type of training. A couple that were heavily promoted during that time was fair and impartial policing, which was a national initiative. It was funded by the administration, and departments were able to get that department-wide training. It focused primarily on implicit biases that police may not even recognize they have. I think another thing that came out of that research was the National Initiative on Building Communities of Trust, which goes back to what my colleague Johnnie said as well. You know, how do we get this national narrative on trust building between police and community? What's that radical change look like? And that training was focused on implicit bias, procedural justice, and reconciliation. So some very strong words, some very strong concepts, and a very big national push. So there has been training, but what I would say is that it's not just training. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand, that training is one piece of a larger whole. And should everyone have it? Yes. Let's just start with that. Let's answer your question. Yes, everyone should have it. If they haven't had training, everyone should have it. However, many have had it, and sometimes it hasn't been implemented correctly. So even if they've had the training, what's been the follow-up? What's been the implementation? What are the measures of success that are put in place to see that the concepts from that training have been not only understood, embraced, but then how are they applied to the day-to-day life of the officer within those communities? Those things are often left off the table. They get the training and then they don't get the follow-up. So yes, training should be done, but I think the bigger conversation is integration, implementation, and accountability department-wide, as well as with the community holding the department accountable. And we can talk more about what types of measures might be necessary to put in place.
That's heavy. That's a lot. So I agree. There definitely needs to be accountability. I think anything we do, there needs to be a level of accountability And that was a very great response, so thank you. I want to share something, just a little tidbit. So I was doing the research. I came across an article in the Community College Daily. The article was titled Police Reform Starts with Training. It's actually July 1st, 2020. And it was the Police Training Academy at Kalamazoo Valley Community College that's led by, I think, our good friend, Victor. And during their training, they had what's called a Culture Week, where the cadets learn about ethics, civil rights, adverse childhood experiences, implicit bias, and cultural awareness. And when I read it like that, is really, now I disagree with the length, probably needs to be longer than a week, but just doing my research, never came across anything like that. They also facilitate racial healing circles, which is probably akin to restorative justice practices that are done in some schools. So I thought that was, and that, would you agree that could possibly be an avenue that some police departments could take in terms of training?
Yeah, there are lots of, actually the Kellogg Foundation, which is also out of our state in Michigan, they have a national initiative called Truth, Reconciliation, Healing, and Transformation. And Kalamazoo is one city and Chicago is also one city. So I was actually in one of the cohort groups that got trained on racial healing circles. So they're embracing those across the city. Now, myself at that time was working in a public safety environment. So I was a representative of public safety to bring that to the public safety sphere. So yes, I think that, you know, looking again, back to Johnnie, I like his word, radical change. Even though I am a peace practitioner and been teaching peace studies for over 20 years. So it's not radical to me, but it may be radical to a new community that hasn't embraced it. And so I think that, you know, looking at different ways of healing and transformation, trust building and trauma, all of those things need to be incorporated into a new model of training. So I applaud our colleagues at Kalamazoo Community College for embracing those concepts. But yes, it is a push, I think, nationally by different organizations to get those types of research and trauma-informed practices towards a public safety environment. And so I'm glad that Chicago embraced it in 2018, and I was one of the first to be trained in that model. So absolutely, I agree that that definitely should be something we should consider, and I know cities are doing it. I think the Kellogg Foundation has done that in maybe 13 locations now, and I may be miscounting, but it's several cities they've embraced, and they're going all over the country trying to push that forward. So I'm glad Kalamazoo's won. Yeah.
Yay, that's something that hopefully other cities going forward will embrace. Is anyone else that would like to chime in on the training aspect?
Yeah, I have to say something about it. And here's the thing about training, and those programs are all great. And some of them are being done in DC and other cities too. And but here's the thing about training. And I went through 2 police academies as a police recruit. And both times, as soon as I got done with the academy, you go out on the street on your first night with your field training officer or your experienced officer that you're working with. And the first thing you're told is, listen, kid, forget what you learned in the academy. Forget what you were trained. I'm going to show you how it's really done out here out on the street. So training really is a matter of culture. Culture is overwhelming the training doctrine. If the police department culture does not encourage following what you learn in the academy, if the first line supervisors and sergeants don't enforce it, if the police chief and the administration, the command staff doesn't send the message continuously that what you learned in the academy is the correct way and this is what we will follow, then training really means nothing. Then officers are going to develop their own methods of dealing with things on the street. And and the other part about training is I think it's just one part of a trilogy for the front end accountability. And I look at police accountability as two different things. It's divided up into the front end and it's divided up into the back end. The front end of accountability has to do with who we hire and our hiring methods and what kind of people we hire, number one. Number two is training, what kind of training we use and whether it's uniform or not. And then number three is what type of policies and rules do we have in writing for the officers to follow, and what policies are we going to train them on. And that trilogy of 3 things, I think, encompass the front end of police accountability. We have to have training, yes, but training is one of the 3 legs of that trilogy, and it has to be enforced from the top down. It has to have a community engagement is really important. And it has to be part of the culture. So I just wanted to say that piece about about the training part. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcia and Michael, for your feedback. I like that. Training is the culture. And with anything, when we work in organizations, they train you, and those are guidelines you're expected to follow. So thank you. Next question.
Well, wait.
Oh,
wait.
you want to see, Johnnie? I was going to say you for my next question, but go ask them. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Resident Attorney.
I want to jump in on this because as the advocate for the defund movement on this panel, I think it's a very key point. What they would do right now is they would antagonize the question. They would antagonize the question for being within a vision of reforming the police and status quo. I think what divesting and investing and defunding and reinvesting, it's a completely different vision for them. And I believe it says, okay, if you're training the police, well, what about these other pieces that we talked about? I mean, what about these other individuals that aren't police or walking alongside with police or social workers or mental health experts? The moment we start talking about training the police as is changing the issue, as resolving it or reforming it, I think that's where they would step in and say, no, let's remember this is a larger vision and it's radical change. And I think it goes to what Michael said. It's like, hey, look, training is that's a, in my opinion, it's a certificate you get for saying, your attendance is complete. You can now move on to the next stage. And then what happens is the overriding culture takes over. And I think the defund movement says that's the problem. What are we going to do that can give us the certification and guarantee that we are changing the culture that's breeding these situations? So I think they're going to antagonize every vision and every articulation of this change and reform if it does not speak to a larger vision and a radical view of how police interact and other personnel interact with the community. So I just wanted to say that from their point of view.
Johnnie, let me chime in on what Johnnie's saying, and I know, and I agree, and Cynthia, I think you might want to jump in, but Johnnie, I agree with you, and I think what Michael said, I think he and I are in violent agreement, as they say, with that the training is just one piece. But I also, I mentioned that implementation piece, and I think that goes to what you're saying, that the accountability that Michael's saying, that not only is there a training component, there has to be a corresponding implementation plan. So you can't just have training, get that certificate. So like what you just said, you can't just check a box. You have to have a plan for your training. And then as Michael, I went through an academy as well. So I know, what it's like to go through an academy. Cynthia's went through one as well. So we've all been through one. And we learned a lot of different things, and we learned a lot of different things once we got out. But part of a true training plan is how do we integrate that training into our department? So it's not just check the box, we did the training. Implementation should be part of the beginning of the training process. So what are the quantitative measures that we're going to use to align those outcomes from what we expect from that training? What are the goals of the training? So when you teach implicit bias, why are we teaching this? What do we expect to see once the officers and the command staff complete this training? And then how are we going to measure what success looks like? So starting from the beginning, what does success look like after they've completed this training? That should be the plan of the entire training. And those measurements can come in different ways, could become performance measures. So they're actually in their performance evaluations. They could be in their community engagement plans that the community holds them accountable for. Okay, you got this training, now what have we done? They can be co-trained with the community. So Johnnie, what you said about, those cross-functional places where you're touching your social workers, you're touching your mental health professionals, you're touching the youth outlets. All of those people can also be co-trained with the police with this co-production model, and they're all coming out with the same goals and initiatives, and they're holding each other accountable. So we are talking about, touch points that community knows what was trained, how it was trained, and then also what the measurement success look like. I think promotional boards need to have part of the training aspect in there. We need our policing strategies to reflect the training. So it's not just about training, it's measures, outcomes, what does success look like, and then making sure that those people at the top to the bottom, like Michael said, are held accountable for making sure that it's done. And then the community needs to know what we were trained on, so they can also make sure that we're held accountable to do what we were told we're supposed to do. So I want to make sure that I didn't say that because I thought we were going to talk about mechanisms later, so I held off. But I want to make sure that I didn't let you think that I thought just training alone, because I clearly don't believe that that is the model that we should have. And I do believe that co-production of training, outcomes,
Right.
measures, and success should be part of the beginning of training, not the end of training.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and Cynthia, I want to just jump in there real quick if you're going to come in on it. I think, you know, a larger point that I think we should pay attention to is, like, America's at a point now where the general public does not trust its institutions, and it's coming across so clear that through our voting and through our responses to different domestic and foreign issues, there's been a loss in the trust, and so that's across the nation. And in regards to this particular issue with defunding the police and the Black Lives Matter movement, they are just like anybody else along the political spectrum that doesn't trust their institutions. If America's going to rise to this challenge, we've got to, like, incorporate the fact that, you know, we talking about it in a form that sounds a lot like what has happened before in the past, and reform and change is going to be viewed skeptically. And I think, you know, as the advocate for defund here on the panel, I want to be their voice for saying, look, you know, it's irritating to hear some of the same things we've talked about for years, it being the answer to this problem. It's not. What's going to be different? What's going to be different this time? So that's I wanted to throw that in there. Sorry, Cynthia.
No, I please, I welcome your thoughts as our, our antagonizer.
Right, the antagonizer in chief.
The one point I was going to add is, yes, I went through the FBI Academy many, many years ago, and I completely agree with Michael that there's a disconnect between what you learn in a law enforcement training academy and then what you're taught when you leave. That training versus culture can never ever be overstated. There's a lot to be said for that. The other thing that I would add is, again, for those of us that have been through a law enforcement academy, when you think back to the curriculum, there's some things that, no, we don't want to share that with the public. There's certain things about how to use sophisticated investigative techniques that we don't want to share with the public. That's kind of proprietary. We want to keep that kind of close hold. But a lot of what we're trained on absolutely should be shared with the public and should be transparent. Our training curriculum involving legal standards, use of force, de-escalation, what is our responsibility in the community as advocates for crime victims. I mean, there's a lot that can be shared with the public. And I know that the FBI has participated in a lot of different TV specials and video specials to invite the public inside the super secret FBI Academy, but to show what it is that we do. And there's a reason for that. You know, we want the public to see what our training involves and to make it very transparent. And that has to be pretty clear as well.
Thank you all. With respect, that was great information about training. And I think people want to know, the public, myself included, who's been held accountable and what metrics are being used, you know, what KPIs, key performance indicators, you know, are you doing random audits to ensure that what's being implemented, you know, you can tell us anything as a public, but when we're constantly being, you know, brutalized or complaints are being made against police officers, then clearly there's a disconnect. So thank you for that. Next question.
If I could add one really quick
Absolutely, absolutely.
So the Matthew Shepard Foundation, Marcia has participated in this, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, some other organizations. We've participated in drafting hate crime training curriculum. And one of the things that we did after training, oh my gosh, I think we're up to 20 different police departments, but one of the things that we've learned is we could train them on how to increase their hate crime enforcement and better engage with the community. But we also established these metrics to figure out if we think we were successful. So we would circle back with the departments and the chiefs and the sheriffs to say, okay, you participated in the training, we're 3 months out, have your policies and procedures changed, yes or no? And they would talk about the changes that they've made to their policies regarding hate crimes enforcement, which was spectacular. And then we would ask all the attendees 6 months later, 12 months later, have you increased your hate crime enforcement? You specifically, whether that means you've arrested somebody for a hate crime, you responded more effectively to a hate crime, you worked with a prosecutor on a hate crime. Have you done something with what you've learned? And how do we track that? And then how do we make that public? You can do this. This is just time and resources to get behind the training to figure out, did it make a difference?
Absolutely.
And I think Gina, I think when your panelists, I mean, one of the listeners asked about the audits and compliance. And I think that, you know, what Cynthia just highlighted is one way of doing it, particularly if you're the one leading the initiative. But, you know, departments also, if they're not used to doing that, then that also is something that has to be, again, that's a cultural change. And so it's something that has to start from, like Michael said, from beginning to end, from bringing people in to how they're taught, to how they're measured, and to how the department audits that throughout the entire cycle of an officer's indoctrination into the police department. I just happened to be over training and compliance and auditing when I was in administrative role for a police department. And that was a key component of it. And those random audits to do so, again, can't speak for every department in the world, but for those that I've worked with, that is a key aspect of ensuring accountability. So just for for the person who asked that question and for Cynthia's example, it can be done. It just has to be taught. And it will be, for some, a cultural shift. For others, it's already been embraced. But I think nationally, again, more to what Johnny's perspective, is this a national thing? Is there a way that this can be embraced across the country? And I know Cynthia's been out there going across the country trying to get on particular topics. But again, how do we reimagine policing? You know, to not jump on the Johnnie bandwagon, but how do we reimagine policing? And what does that look like? And what is it going to take to really get into that culture and change the culture of how we look at ourselves, how we look at our communities, and how we serve each other better? So I think that, you know, I can 100% agree with Johnnie on that. We do need to reimagine what this could look like.
Thank you. Thanks for agreeing with Johnnie since he's playing devil advocate.
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, like I think the advocacy is becoming effective.
Thank you so much. Michael, working in the DC Office of Police Complaints must be tense right now and under incredible scrutiny as DC prepares for another week of protests and cries for change. You have the DC suggestion box, excuse me, so to speak. What are people saying? Are there calls to reform or defund the police?
You know, we're hearing a lot of different things. One of the things we do that you may not be aware of is we monitor the protests, and we go out and monitor what the police are doing during all the major protests. And myself and a good portion of my staff have been out there for the last several weeks in the evenings, monitoring what the protests are doing, saying, talking about. And we watch it on the news media and social media too. I mean, there's all sorts of different takes on things. But right now, I mean, the level of community distrust of the police department is at a crescendo. It's at an extreme high right now. And that's the underlying current of what almost everyone is saying, is the lack of trust in the police. Even if they had some minimal degree of trust before, it's all, you know, it's been a very rapid deterioration over the past month and a half. And it's kind of sad to see. But I think the point being, though, is that people are listening now. The thing that I'm a little bit concerned about is people listened also in the 60s. People listened early also in the late 80s. You know, we've been talking about some of these things for the duration of my entire career, which is going on 42 years now in the public sector. We've been talking about some of these same things. And my concern is that we've got to carry these things through really to fruition this time. This is our one big chance that we've had, the biggest chance we've had in my career of making reforms that are going to be lasting. And it's going to be a complex matter. That's why I say that we have to look at things at the back end and at the front end for accountability. You know, our office, the Office of Police Complaints, I'll put in a plug for that. You know, we do a little bit of both. We hold officers accountable by independently investigating misconduct on the police department. And we also make recommendations for policies, procedures, and training to the police department at the front end. And Some of that's about to expand with some new legislation that's being passed. But I really am a strong advocate of, as part of the big piece of solving what we're looking at right now, the big piece of the puzzle is really civilian oversight. That's what we do in the Office of Police Complaints, and I think there's a room for a significant expansion of community oversight and civilian oversight of police, both at the front end and at the middle and at the back end. If we get the community much more involved in part of the process, even as part of the decision-making process, such as what the level of discipline should be in, not just doing investigating, but looking at policies and being involved in the approval process for policies. It's really a complex matter, and my head really just starts spinning when I think of all the ways that we should get involved in all the different things that we need to do here. But what I'm happiest to hear from things that I'm hearing in the community is that we're at a crescendo right now, and that local governments and federal government at least is making efforts now to maintain the conversation. We're doing that right now here today, maintaining the conversation. And places are actually acting on it. The DC Council acted on it yesterday. By way of another example, they've expanded my office's jurisdiction, at least in the temporary 90-day legislation, and I hope it goes to permanent legislation, where we can start doing some of that auditing that you were just talking about. And that means that whenever we get a complaint, assuming the legislation will become permanent eventually, whenever we get a complaint now, we can look at other things that happened during the course of that incident, whether or not we received a complaint, and determine whether the officers were complying with policy, not just looking at one particular part of what a complaint encompassed. And we do that through the body-worn camera system. And all of our investigators in my office have direct access to every body-worn camera in DC with Metropolitan Police Department. And it's really increased our ability to investigate and audit police misconduct. And it's one of the tools I think that's coming out. And I think the other tool that I think we really have to expand on, as I just mentioned, is greatly expanding civilian oversight and civilian involvement in policing.
Thank you so
Gina,
much.
could I add something to what Mike just said?
2 minutes?
All right, 2 minutes. I'll keep it at 2 minutes. I wanted to say I agree with him with the looking at, the models for civilian oversight. With my role at Hillard Heintze in law enforcement consulting, we often are called in to work with different cities for different reasons. It could be an incident. It could be a department being proactive, wanting to know, what's working, what's not working, what can they improve on. It could be a new chief coming in saying, I need a roadmap to what I should do to involve my community and co-produce policing. So 3 of the things that Mike mentioned that they're doing in DC, I know are happening on some national levels, particularly looking at different models for at NACOL, where they actually have all of the different civilian oversight models. One city actually engaged us to look, compare their city to 13 different oversight models to come up with, how they can involve their community in oversight. So I know departments are looking at these things. Again, good examples of great policing and great initiative. The other issue he mentioned was having community involved in policy review. I know personally, and I'm personally involved in a couple of cities that are doing that, and have been involved in cities prior that have had committees, task force working groups that have looked at policy and had substantive say in policy development and co-produced policies. So I know our firm supports that. We work with departments to try to help create that framework. And I've seen that be a national trend, even with our work with IACP, as far as panels with civilian oversight. I think we just had one last year where 3 civilian oversight agencies talked about how they're working well with their communities. So it is definitely a national push, I believe. And I don't know if everybody's embracing it, but I agree with Michael that it's another way for community to have a voice. But I think looking creatively at ways of bringing the community to the table, whether it's civilian oversight, civilians involved in policy, civilians involved in co-training models, or civilians just bringing, being at the table as advisory boards. There's so many different ways. And I think we really need to take an inventory of what we've done in the past that has worked. Like Johnnie said, don't do the old things. Don't stay in the old ways. But I do think there are some things that have happened that have actually moved the needle of equity and inclusion. we need to take inventory of those because there's research behind them. But we also need to say, what do we need to do differently that we've never, ever done before to involve the community in police reform? So I agree with everybody on the panel for that one. So
Yeah,
I think that was 2 minutes, Gina.
That was slightly longer, 2 minutes. I just want to say one thing. First, I want to thank Michael, Marcia for your comments. I have a comment. It's not necessarily a question needs to be answered, but more thought-provoking. So when you speak of community involvement, think about communities in some of these large urban cities or where African Americans, Chicago, the Dallas, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., wherever. And you want the community to be involved, but the communities are just, they don't trust. They have been falsely accused. They're just tired. They're mentally, emotionally exhausted. How, not to answer the question, how do you propose you get these people to the table to participate? And I think these are amazing initiatives, but if people are tired, there's no trust. How do we move that? Where do we start? So that's a question, just posing it for food for thought, because we'll be here till 5 o'clock. We took that question on, but I think that's important to think how do you re-engage a community that has been disengaged because of the community, because of the relations with the police, and not just in 2020, but as Michael said, back to 1960. In my opening remarks, I say that this has been going on since 1960. So, this is definitely something that needs some attention. We are.
Gina, can I jump in on that? Can I jump in on that just really quickly?
Can you do it in 2 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's no way we can talk about this and the civilian oversight without tackling the issue of qualified immunity. As a trial lawyer, it's a huge obstacle for trial lawyers who get calls from clients and potential clients who've been injured, brutalized by the police, to take their case and move it forward when we know that qualified immunity is such a huge obstacle. Exactly. And that has to be addressed on the national level. So the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act from the Democrats' bill has that as a major component. It was violently, loudly missing from the Republicans' version of the bill. So that means we're going to have a huge debate over that. If we're really going to tackle this issue, we have to get that issue in front of this because, listen, Michael, you're over the police complaint board. That's a process that is usually initiated alongside a civilian civil action to try to get justice. Obviously, nobody wants any cases that that are frivolous or don't have any backbone or any factual substantive nature up to it. But, there are a lot of cases that need to be heard and they get dismissed before they even get in front of a judge or a jury on the qualified immunity. Now, if we really want to tackle that, there is a joining at the hip between the government and the police department from the qualified immunity position. I encourage anybody listening anybody watching this to look up the public justice explanation of the qualified immunity so you can educate yourself about it. But listen, let's be honest. The government doesn't want to pay a huge amount of money out of its tax base and budget for claims against police officers, and police officers don't want to be held accountable. So it's a tough issue to tackle, but there's no way we can really talk about this level of civilian oversight and change if we don't tackle the qualified immunity structure. So I wanted to throw that out there, and I think it does speak to your comment and your question, Gina. How do we help people to get involved? Well, they have to have advocates and representatives who can actually move their case forward. And if they don't get moved forward and they don't get heard, and the police know that they can get away with whatever happens under the qualified immunity, then there won't be any change because there's no accountability. So I wanted to throw that out there, and I'd be curious to hear your point of view on it, Mike. And I'm sorry, I'm throwing time and Michael on it, but Gina, I just wanted to kind of bring that in at the forefront of this conversation.
No, I appreciate that. I wanted Cynthia. So
I was going to say Cynthia. I thought she might want to add something.
Cynthia's background.
Cynthia, exactly. Sorry, yes, Cynthia.
So Cynthia, thank you, Johnnie, for ushering in qualified immunity. What are your thoughts about amending qualified immunity?
So it helps to just, again, and I'll be really brief. So for those of you who have not looked this up quickly at Johnny's suggestion, it's a judicial created doctrine. It's about 40 years old. And what it basically says is that a law enforcement official cannot be held civilly liable unless there is some prior judicial opinion stating that that particular conduct at issue clearly violated established law. So if you have a police officer who used excessive force against someone and he's being sued for that misconduct, unless there is a prior case dealing with that exact conduct that said that exact conduct was not permitted, that officer is not going to be held liable. So I think if you really break this down, it makes perfect sense why it needs to be revised. I don't think that anybody wants a police officer, whether they're a police officer family or a child of a police officer, you want police officers to be held accountable, just like I was. When I was an FBI agent, I was told in the academy, you might want to think really clearly about getting some malpractice insurance. And I thought, for what? And they said, because you could be held civilly liable for misconduct. And I thought, oh God, malpractice insurance. And then I started thinking, well, wait a minute. Attorneys have it, doctors have it, nurses have it. You look at different professions, they have insurance in case something goes wrong. A plumber comes to fix your toilet, pretty sure they have insurance if they screw it up, right? They're not going to be absolved of liability if a contractor screws up something related to your brand new home. Everybody has some kind of accountability process and procedure in place. Police officers with the profession that they have must be held to account. And taxpayers cannot be forced, in my view, should never be forced to pay millions upon millions of dollars to a victim of police misconduct just because the officer got off scot-free. The one other point that I would say is you have to really pay attention to what the victim is looking for. If the victim is looking for financial compensation, I was injured, I want to sue that police officer for my injury, I want money out of that police officer. I hate to break it to you, but not all police officers are wealthy. They don't have the money you're looking for, Mr. and Mrs. Crime Victim. You're going to have to seek that somewhere else. If you're looking for punishment, okay, that's something else we need to address, which is a standardized database to log in police officers who commit misconduct. That's something else, but it needs to be addressed. Police officers should be held accountable for their actions in civil court, just like I would be, and all of us would be as attorneys. If we commit malpractice, we're held to account. Police officers should have no different process and procedure in place.
Thank you for that. We are running short on time, so I have a question. I have a comment and then a question. I'm going to try and tie in two of my questions. The Washington Post headline from June 17th, 2020 reads, FBI launched database on police use of force last year, but only 40% of police participated. Also want to tie in the question, so that with respect to how would a database be enforced, but also we're going to, Michael, as you mentioned before, introduction of body cams. Now we know body cameras have been used and the footage has definitely failed those victims. So, and another element of this is the blue wall of silence. So how would we enforce something when police officers aren't even necessarily participating? Where's the checks and balance? There's no accountability. People don't want to tell on their fellow police officers because of fear of retaliation. So if we can just wrap it up real quick, how would national database and how would the use of more body cameras and dash cams prevent what's already being prevented? Because clearly if that was the case, then there would be several people would be alive. So anyone can take the lead.
Gina, I'll do two seconds on the FBI database, since I think I'm the only FBI veteran here. I'll take the hit on that one. So the database started, I think, accepting applications in the beginning of 2019. The FBI has promised to release the data this summer. So I look forward to reviewing that, just like everyone else on the panel. I hope they are true to their word with that. The other thing is burn grants, COPS grants, DOJ grants. You encourage departments to submit data to the FBI by the money. You give them money, you give them grant money if they participate in the database. You withhold money if they don't. It's the typical carrot and stick that usually works really, really well with law enforcement. They need federal money to operate. One way to give them that is to participate in hate crime statistics, use of force database, et cetera. Give them money to do it.
Okay.
And Gina, I'll just jump in on one part on the aspect, and I think it ties into what Michael had said earlier about cultural change. There are some unique initiatives that have been embraced across the country, and some of the departments that have had some huge deficits in trust. And I know Cynthia worked in New Orleans after Katrina to do some investigations as civil rights investigations for what was going on there. And I worked with them after they were under consent decree with one of their compliance managers who is now in Baltimore working in compliance. And they put some really good metrics in place to try to change culture. So I think there are some models out there. And that's why I said we can't throw out everything that we've done for the last 50, 60 years that we've all talked about have not been sustained. But there are some good practices out there that we can pick from, that we can grow. And I know that they taught they created a good, like kind of are you my brother's keeper type model of ethics training that's been embraced across the country as a good cultural shift internally to policing, to that aspect of changing that blue code, as you said. So I know New Orleans does have a good training model that people are looking at as a kind of a next step process for training in that area. So I'll leave my comment for that one.
Thank you. Michael?
I'll take the body cam piece in my 30 seconds. Body cams, they're good. Little known factoid, when we implemented body cams in DC, the number of citizen complaints we received went up, continued to go up, and they continue to go up this day. They've gone up every year in the 4 years since we initiated body cameras. They've made our job of police accountability at the back end, holding officers accountable, much easier. We almost always have a third-party independent witness at every incident now. We never had that before. And I believe that that's one of the main reasons why our complaints have gone up, is because people now believe that their version of the event will be believed because there is an independent witness now. So body cameras are good. I think federal agencies need to get on the bandwagon. It's kind of ironic that a lot of the DOJ consent decrees have required police departments to implement things like body cameras, and they have failed to do so themselves in federal agencies. So I'm a strong advocate for it.
Thank you. Body cameras work when they're turned on, but that's a whole nother conversation. Johnnie?
Yeah, and look, as the advocate for the defund movement on this panel, I believe it's very important to have it be said that everything with the database and the body cameras, and then I think that's all moving in the right direction. But I think the main thing that they would want to be said here is broaden the view of how the police look. In terms of talking about policing, that third-party witness that Michael just mentioned, that needs to be a part of the institution of the police response to any given event. And then just reimagining and reinventing the police department and our police to serve the public in a way that it's not a war between the police and the public. So everything that we've utilized and that has come about to help this creating larger numbers and accountability, take that and add it more in a reimagined structure. And I think that's the main point from the defund movement that I think needs to keep being a part of the conversation.
Thank you. And Cynthia, any last comments, remarks?
I appreciate Johnnie representing the defund movement. That's my last comment. It would not have been probably as robust a panel had somebody not taken that view. So I appreciate that, Johnnie.
And I think reimagine is our word for the day.
Reimagine, word for the day. All right, so word for the day is reimagine. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the first time ever, it is 2:59. We did it. I want to thank each and every one of you, Marcia, Cynthia, Michael, and Johnnie, for sharing your expertise, your insight. Johnnie, extra special thank you for playing an unnatural role, but you definitely gave some great insight. Thank you to our 20-something participants. And just thank you. So this conversation isn't over. It's an ongoing conversation. Please, for those of you who are listening, please encourage yourself, your family members to get involved in the community. If you live in a community, family or friends, and you're tired of the police or the abuse and you know what's going on, please get involved. We can no longer, even people of non-color, please get involved. This is in fact everyone in some shape, form, or fashion. So we can no longer, stay in our little warm, cozy, safe environments. We all have a justice piece to do to make sure that policing is changed and the culture, so that we all, because they can actually do what they're supposed to do, protect and serve. So thank you all, and everyone have a great day, a great weekend.
Thank you.
This was
Thanks,
great.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Take
Bye.
care, everyone. Bye.